The survival training room was huge and cold. Metal walls stretched up to the ceiling, and bright lights made everything look sharp and clean. Jake Morrison stood with his back straight, trying not to look nervous. Around him, 12 other students waited in a loose circle. They were all different kinds of aliens, and Jake was the only human in the group. Professor Zethkar walked into the center of the circle. He was tall, maybe 8 feet, and his body looked like it was made of living crystal. Light moved through him in waves of blue and green. When he spoke, his voice sounded like wind chimes mixed with thunder. "Today, you will take your final survival test," the professor said. His crystal body flashed brighter as he talked. "This test will show us if you can stay alive in the worst conditions in space." Jake looked around at the other students. There was Clixara, who looked like a giant praying mantis with 4 arms. Her people, the Xerians, were famous for building amazing machines. Next to her stood Veltar, a huge slug-like creature from the Gorvani race. The Gorvani could live almost anywhere, even in space without suits. Then there were the Nephians, who were made of gas and lived inside special robot bodies. The Kalari had 6 arms and could climb walls like spiders. There were others too, all from planets far from Earth. Most of them had been traveling through space for thousands of years before humans even learned to make fire. "You will be tested on planet Kepler 442c, Professor Zethkar continued. "The computer will make this room feel exactly like that planet. The air there will kill you in minutes. The temperature is 40 degrees below zero. There are strong winds and poison gas everywhere." Jake felt his stomach tighten. He had studied Kepler 442c in class. It was one of the most dangerous planets known to the galaxy. Even the toughest space explorers avoided it. "You will have 1 hour," the professor said. "In that time, you must build a shelter that can keep you alive for 3 days. If you fail, you will be kicked out of the university." The other students started whispering to each other in their own languages. Jake caught some of the words through his translator device. They were talking about him. "The human will not last. 10 minutes, said one of the Kalari in a voice like clicking metal. "His people just learned to fly between stars 15 years ago. They are still babies in space." "Humans are weak," agreed Clixara, flexing her 4 arms. "They need machines to do everything for them. They cannot even breathe in space without help." Jake kept his face calm, but inside he was angry. Yes, humans were new to space travel. Yes, they did not have the advanced technology that other races had. But that did not make them weak. His grandfather had helped rebuild Detroit after the climate wars using nothing but scrap metal and determination. His father had fixed cars and trucks for 30 years with whatever tools he could find. Jake had grown up learning that you work with what you have, not what you wish you had. Professor Zethkar raised one crystal arm. "The test will begin in 60 seconds. Look around the room. You will see pieces of metal, broken machines, and other materials. This is what crashed spaceships leave behind on hostile planets. You must use only these materials to build your shelter." Jake looked at the pile of junk scattered around the room. There were bent metal plates, broken computer parts, pieces of pipe, and what looked like parts from old spacesuits. Most of it was rusty and damaged. To the alien students, it probably looked like useless garbage. But Jake saw something different. He saw resources. The bent metal could be shaped into walls. The computer parts had power cells inside them. The spacesuit pieces had air recyclers that might still work. His mind was already putting together a plan. "The environment simulation will start now," Professor Zethkar announced. The room began to change. The temperature dropped fast and Jake could see his breath in the air. The lights dimmed to look like the weak sun of Kepler 442c. Machines hidden in the walls started making the sound of howling wind. A thin mist filled the air, and Jake's suit computer beeped a warning about poison gas. "Your 1 hour starts now," the professor said. The other students immediately spread out and began studying the materials carefully. The Xerians started measuring pieces of metal with small devices. The Gorvani began testing the chemical makeup of everything they touched. The Nephians opened up their robot suits and pulled out advanced scanners. They were all doing exactly what the university had taught them to do. Analyze first. Plan carefully. Make sure every calculation was perfect before starting to build. Jake did not analyze anything. He had already seen what he needed. He walked straight to a large piece of curved metal that looked like part of a spaceship's hull. It was about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, perfect for the base of a shelter. Next to it was a small fusion power cell that was still glowing. That meant it had energy left in it. "The human is moving too fast," Veltar said to the others. "He has not even tested the materials yet. He will make mistakes." But Jake was not making mistakes. He was doing what humans had always done when they needed to survive. He was adapting quickly to what was available. He dragged the curved metal to a spot against the wall where it would be protected from the wind. Then he started gathering other pieces. 3 oxygen recyclers from old spacesuits, a bundle of thermal insulation that had fallen out of a broken heating unit, some metal pipes that could be used to connect everything together. The alien students were still in their planning phase, carefully documenting every piece of material and running calculations on their computers. They had been taught that proper planning prevented poor performance. But Jake had been taught something different. His father had always said that sometimes you do not have time to plan perfectly. Sometimes you just have to start building and figure it out as you go. Professor Zethkar watched Jake work with growing interest. In 300 years of teaching, he had never seen a student skip the analysis phase completely. It went against everything the university taught about survival in space. 10 minutes had passed and the other students were still planning. Jake was already connecting his second oxygen recycler to the power cell. Jake moved through the debris field like he had done this 100 times before. His hands grabbed pieces of metal and equipment, while his eyes scanned for the next useful item. Behind him, the curved hull piece was already positioned against the wall, anchored with heavy rocks to keep the wind from moving it. The other students were still measuring and calculating. Clixera had pulled out a device that looked like a small telescope and was examining each piece of metal for stress fractures. She moved slowly and carefully, the way her people had been taught for thousands of years. "Structural integrity must be verified before construction begins," she said to Veltar, who was testing the chemical composition of a piece of plastic with his tongue. "The human is being reckless. His shelter will collapse within the first hour." But Jake was not being reckless, he was being efficient. While Clixara tested one piece of metal, Jake had already identified 6 pieces that would work for his shelter. He did not need to know the exact stress tolerance of each piece. He just needed to know if it was strong enough to hold up against wind and cold. The fusion power cell was the key to everything. Jake had spotted it within the first 30 seconds of the test. Most of the alien students had ignored it because it was small and did not look important. But Jake knew that power meant life support, and life support meant survival. He connected the first oxygen recycler to the power cell using a piece of cable he had pulled from a broken computer. The connection was not perfect, but it worked. The recycler hummed to life and began processing the toxic air outside into breathable oxygen. "Impossible," whispered one of the Nephians. "The human is connecting systems without running compatibility tests. Those components were not designed to work together." Professor Zethkar moved closer to watch Jake work. The human was doing something that the professor had never seen in 3 centuries of teaching. He was improvising solutions in real time, making connections that should not work but somehow did. Jake found the second oxygen recycler buried under a pile of metal scraps. This one was damaged, with a crack in the outer casing, but the internal components looked intact. He pulled out a piece of thermal tape from his toolkit and wrapped it around the crack. It was not a permanent fix, but it would hold long enough for the test. The alien students were fascinated and horrified at the same time. Everything Jake was doing went against their training. They had been taught to never use damaged equipment, to always test compatibility before making connections, to plan every step before taking action. "He is going to kill himself," said Veltar, watching Jake connect the damaged recycler to his power system. "That equipment is not safe to use." But Jake knew something the aliens did not understand. Sometimes safe equipment was not available. Sometimes you had to make do with what you could find. His grandfather had taught him that during the stories about rebuilding Detroit. The city had been destroyed by climate disasters and economic collapse. The people who rebuilt it did not have perfect materials or ideal conditions. They had scrap metal, broken concrete, and determination. You use what works, his grandfather had always said. You do not wait for perfect conditions because perfect conditions never come. Jake dragged a large piece of thermal insulation over to his shelter. It was dirty and torn in several places, but most of it was intact. He began wrapping it around the curved hull piece, creating a barrier between the inside of his shelter and the toxic air outside. The insulation was not designed for this purpose. It had come from some kind of industrial heating system, probably used to keep pipes from freezing in space. But insulation was insulation. It would keep the heat in and the cold out, regardless of what it was originally designed for. 20 minutes had passed. Jake's shelter was taking shape while the other students were still in the planning phase. He had created a basic structure with life support and thermal protection. Now he needed to seal it and add the finishing touches. He found a roll of metal sheeting that had been twisted and bent by some kind of accident. Most of the alien students had dismissed it as unusable because it was not flat and perfect. But Jake saw potential. He could hammer it flat enough to use as a door for his shelter. Using a piece of heavy pipe as a hammer and a flat rock as an anvil, Jake began straightening the metal sheeting. The sound of metal on metal rang through the chamber, echoing off the walls. The other students stopped their work to stare at him. "What is he doing?" asked one of the Kalari. "He is making noise and drawing attention. Predators would hear him from miles away." "There are no predators in this simulation," replied Klixara. "But his technique is crude. We have tools that can reshape metal with precision. Why is he using such primitive methods?" Professor Zethkar did not answer, but he was thinking the same thing. The human had access to the same advanced tools as the other students. His species might be new to space travel, but the university provided all students with standard equipment. So why was Jake choosing to use rocks and pipes instead of precision instruments? The answer came to him as he watched Jake work. The human was not just building a shelter. He was demonstrating a philosophy. He was showing that survival did not depend on having the best tools or the most advanced technology. Survival depended on the ability to make anything work, even if it was not perfect. Jake finished hammering the metal door and fitted it over the entrance to his shelter. He used more thermal tape to seal the edges, creating an airtight barrier. Then he connected the third oxygen recycler to his power system, giving him backup life support in case one of the other units failed. 30 minutes had passed. The alien students were finally beginning to build their shelters, but they were moving slowly and carefully, following complex blueprints they had drawn during the planning phase. Jake stepped back and looked at his completed shelter. It was not beautiful. It was not perfect, but it was functional, and it would keep him alive. That was all that mattered. Jake crawled inside his shelter and began connecting the final systems. The space was small, just big enough for one person to lie down, but it felt warm and safe. The oxygen recyclers hummed quietly in the background, and the thermal insulation was already keeping the cold out. He pulled out his toolkit and started working on the power distribution system. The fusion cell was designed to power a small spaceship, not a survival shelter, so he needed to step down the voltage to avoid burning out his equipment. Using a voltage regulator he had pulled from a broken computer, Jake created a safe power supply for all his systems. Outside his shelter, the other students were struggling with their own construction projects. Klixara had built a framework of metal beams that looked like the skeleton of a house, but she had not yet figured out how to seal it against the toxic atmosphere. Her calculations showed that her design would work perfectly, but theory and practice were two different things. Feltar had created a dome-shaped structure using his species' natural ability to secrete a hard, shell-like substance. It was beautiful and strong, but he had forgotten to include any kind of air circulation system. He would suffocate inside his own perfect shelter. The Nephians had built something that looked like a small factory, complete with multiple air filtration systems and backup power supplies. But their design was so complex that they were still trying to get all the systems to work together. Every time they fixed one problem, two more problems appeared. Professor Zethkar walked around the room, observing each student's progress. He had been teaching for 300 years, and he had never seen such a variety of approaches to the same problem. But what really caught his attention was the human's shelter. From the outside, Jake's shelter looked like a pile of junk held together. With tape and wire, it was ugly and crude compared to the elegant designs of the other students. But Professor Zethkar's sensors told a different story. The internal temperature was stable at 21 degrees. The air quality was perfect. The power systems were running efficiently with no sign of overload. How is this possible? The professor muttered to himself. His crystalline body flickered with confusion. The human's shelter violated every principle of proper engineering. It should not work, but it was working better than any of the other designs. Jake was now working on the final component of his shelter. He had noticed that the fusion cell generated more heat than his systems needed, so he was building a heat distribution system to warm the entire shelter evenly. He used pieces of metal pipe to create a simple radiator system, running heated air from the fusion cell through tubes that circled the inside of his shelter. The design was basic but effective. Hot air flowed through the pipes, warming the entire space, while cool air was drawn back to the fusion cell to be heated again. It was the same principle used in old-fashioned car radiators, technology that humans had been using for over a century. "This is wrong," said Klixara, watching Jake through the transparent section of his shelter wall. "He is using primitive heating methods. Our people developed efficient thermal management systems thousands of years ago. Why is he not using modern technology?" "Because it works," said Veltar, who had temporarily stopped working on his own shelter to watch the human. "Look at his temperature readings. His shelter is warmer than any of ours." Jake heard the conversation through his communication system, but did not respond. He was too focused on his work. He had just realized that he could use the excess heat from his fusion cell for another purpose. By running the heated air through a simple condensation system, he could extract water from the humid air inside his shelter. Fresh water was always valuable in survival situations. Using a piece of plastic tubing and a metal container, Jake built a water collection system in less than 5 minutes. It was not complicated, just a way to cool the heated air and collect the moisture that condensed out. But it gave him a renewable source of drinking water, something that none of the other students had thought to include in their designs. Professor Zethkar was now standing directly outside Jake's shelter, studying every detail with his advanced sensors. The human had created a complete life support system using nothing but scrap materials and basic engineering principles. It was crude, but it was also brilliant. "Student Morrison," the professor called out, "please explain your construction methodology." Jake looked up from his work. "My what?" "How did you decide which materials to use? What calculations did you perform to ensure structural integrity? Where are your safety protocols?" Jake shrugged. "I looked at what was available and figured out how to make it work. The curved metal piece was perfect for a base because it was already the right shape. The fusion cell had plenty of power for what I needed. The oxygen recyclers were designed to work in harsh conditions, so I knew they would be reliable. But you performed no stress analysis, no compatibility testing, no safety verification," the professor insisted. "How do you know your shelter will not fail?" "Because I built it to work, not to be perfect," Jake replied. "My dad always said that a working solution is better than a perfect plan that never gets finished." The professor's crystalline structure pulsed with different colors as he processed this information. In his centuries of teaching, he had always emphasized the importance of proper planning and precise calculations. The idea of building something without detailed analysis was completely foreign to him, but the evidence was right in front of him. The human's crude shelter was outperforming the carefully designed structures of students from the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. At that moment, Jake's communication system chimed. He had been inside his shelter for exactly 10 minutes, and all systems were running perfectly. He pressed the button to open his door and stepped outside. "Done," he announced to Professor Zethkar. The chamber fell silent. Even the simulated wind seemed to pause. Every student in the room stopped working and stared at the human who had just completed the survival test in 10 minutes. Professor Zethkar stared at Jake for a long moment. His crystalline body shifted through colors that none of the students had ever seen before. Confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been amazement all flowed through his transparent form. "Impossible," the professor said. His voice carried through the chamber like the sound of breaking glass. "You cannot be finished. No student has ever completed this test in less than 45 minutes. Jake stood next to his shelter with his arms crossed. "Want to check it out?" The professor moved closer, his sensors scanning every inch of Jake's construction. The readings were perfect. Internal temperature was stable. Air quality was better than most space stations. The power systems were running at optimal efficiency with plenty of reserve capacity. "This cannot be correct," Professor Zethkar muttered. He activated his most advanced scanning equipment, devices that could analyze materials down to the molecular level. "Run full diagnostic protocols. Check all systems for potential failure points." The other students gathered around to watch. Their own shelters were still incomplete, some barely started. Klixara had managed to get her framework up, but it was still open to the toxic air. Veltar's dome was sealed but had no air circulation. The Nephians were still trying to debug their complex computer systems. "Maybe his equipment is broken," suggested one of the Kalari. "Human technology is primitive. His sensors might be giving false readings." But Professor Zethkar's equipment was not human technology. It was Vorthak engineering, some of the most advanced in the galaxy. And it was telling him that Jake's shelter was not just functional. It was superior to anything he had seen in decades of teaching. "Initiate stress testing," the professor commanded. His voice had taken on a harder edge. If the human had somehow cheated, the stress tests would reveal it. The environmental simulation changed. The temperature dropped from -40 to -60 degrees. The wind speed doubled. The concentration of toxic gases in the air increased by 300%. These were conditions that would kill most life forms in minutes. Jake's shelter responded automatically. The heat distribution system adjusted to compensate for the increased cold. The air recyclers worked harder to process the more toxic atmosphere. The structural supports held firm against the stronger winds. "More," Professor Zethkar said. He was no longer testing just Jake's shelter. He was testing his own understanding of what was possible. Seismic activity began shaking the ground. The chamber simulated earthquakes that would collapse most buildings. The toxic gas concentration increased again, reaching levels found only on the most hostile planets in the galaxy. Jake's shelter not only survived, it thrived. The flexible connections he had used allowed the structure to move with the earthquakes instead of fighting them. The thermal tape stretched and flexed, but held its seal. The fusion cell automatically increased its output to power the harder-working life support systems. "How?" Professor Zethkar demanded. His crystalline form was now pulsing rapidly through colors that indicated extreme agitation. "Your species has been in space for 15 years. 15 years. My people have been building survival shelters for 50,000 years. How did you surpass millennia of accumulated knowledge in 10 minutes? Jake looked around at the other students, who were all staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to fear. Some of them had stopped working on their own shelters entirely, too shocked by what they were seeing to continue. "You want to know the truth?" Jake asked. "My species learned to survive before we ever left our planet. We have been building shelters, from scrap materials for thousands of years." He gestured toward his shelter. "This is not advanced technology. This is basic human engineering. When I was 12 years old, my friends and I built a better shelter than this in my backyard using cardboard boxes and duct tape." "Impossible," said Klixara. "Cardboard and tape cannot provide life support in hostile environments." "No, but the principle is the same," Jake replied. "You find materials that can do the job. You put them together in a way that works. You do not worry about whether it looks perfect or follows the rules in some textbook." Professor Zethkar was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "But your construction methods violate every safety protocol. You used damaged equipment. You made connections without compatibility testing. You sealed joints with tape instead of proper bonding agents. And it works, Jake said simply. Sometimes that is all that matters. The professor activated his communication system and called up the records from 3 centuries of teaching. Student after student, species after species, all following the same methodical approach. Plan carefully, test everything. Use only certified materials. Follow all safety protocols. And yet here was a human who had ignored every rule and created something better than any of them. This challenges everything we teach, the professor said quietly. If your methods are superior, then we have been wrong for thousands of years. Jake shook his head. You are not wrong. Your methods work for your people, but my people learn to survive in a different way. We learned that perfect conditions never exist. We learned that you have to work with what you have, not what you wish you had. He pointed to the other students who were still struggling with their careful, methodical construction projects. They are building shelters the way engineers build spaceships. I am building a shelter the way humans build homes after a disaster. Professor Zethkar looked at Jake's shelter again, then at the partially completed structures around the room. For the first time in his long teaching career, he wondered if there might be more than one right way to solve a problem. Continue with your construction, he told the other students. But observe the humans' methods. There may be lessons here for all of us. As the other students reluctantly returned to their work, Professor Zethkar made a decision that would change how survival was taught throughout the galaxy. He began recording everything Jake had done, documenting methods that contradicted centuries of established wisdom, but produced undeniably superior results. 2 hours later, the survival test officially ended. Jake sat comfortably inside his shelter reading a book on his tablet while his systems hummed quietly around him. The temperature outside had been pushed to -80 degrees during the final stress test, but inside his shelter it remained a comfortable 22 degrees. The other students had not fared as well. Clixera had managed to complete her shelter, but it barely held together under the extreme conditions. Veltar had been forced to abandon his dome when the air circulation failed. 3 of the Nephians had given up entirely when their complex computer systems crashed. Only 5 of the 13 students had managed to build functioning shelters, and none of them had the reliability and efficiency of Jake's design. Professor Zethkar deactivated the environmental simulation, and the chamber returned to normal conditions. The toxic air cleared, the temperature rose, and the artificial wind stopped howling. Students began emerging from their shelters, some looking exhausted and defeated. The test is complete, Professor Zethkar announced. Please gather your equipment and prepare for evaluation. Jake stepped out of his shelter and began disconnecting his systems. As he worked, the other students gathered around to watch. They seemed fascinated by his simple but effective design. How did you know the fusion cell would not overload? Asked one of the Kalari. You connected 3 oxygen recyclers to a power source designed for 1. I checked the power ratings, Jake replied, unplugging a cable. The fusion cell can handle 5 times what I was using. Basic math. But you did not run compatibility tests, insisted Clixera. Those recyclers were from different manufacturers. They use different communication protocols. Jake shrugged. They all process air the same way. I did not need them to talk to each other, just to work. Professor Zethkar listened to this conversation with growing interest. The human was describing a completely different approach to problem solving. Where other species focused on perfect integration and flawless communication between systems, humans seemed to focus on basic functionality. Student Morrison, the professor called out. Please remain after the others leave. I wish to discuss your performance. The other students filed out of the chamber, many of them still talking in hushed voices about what they had witnessed. Some looked impressed. Others seemed confused or even angry. The idea that their advanced knowledge could be surpassed by primitive human methods was difficult for them to accept. When the chamber was empty except for Jake and Professor Zethkar, the professor approached the human student directly. In 300 years of teaching, the professor began, I have never seen anything like what you accomplished today. You have forced me to question everything I thought I knew about survival engineering. Jake finished packing his tools and looked up at the tall crystalline being. I just did what needed to be done. But that is precisely the point, Professor Zethkar said. His body pulsed with soft blue light. Every other species approaches survival as an engineering problem. They analyze, calculate, optimize, and then build. You approached it as a practical problem. You identified what you needed to stay alive and found the fastest way to achieve it. The professor walked over to Jake's dismantled shelter and examined the components. This thermal tape should not have been strong enough to seal against the pressure differential we created. These oxygen recyclers should not have been able to work together without proper interface protocols. This heating system violates basic thermodynamic efficiency principles. But it worked, Jake said. Yes, it worked, the professor agreed. It worked better than designs created by species with thousands of years more experience than yours. And that raises a disturbing question. Jake raised an eyebrow. What question? What if we have been teaching survival incorrectly for millennia? Professor Zethkar's crystalline structure shifted to a deep purple color. What if the pursuit of perfect solutions has made us unable to create good solutions quickly? The professor activated a holographic display that showed statistics from centuries of survival tests. The average completion time for this test is 53 minutes. The best previous record was 38 minutes, set by a Gorvani student, 200 years ago. You finished in 10 minutes and created a shelter that outperformed all of them. Jake looked at the data with interest. Maybe the problem is that you are all thinking too hard about it. Explain. When you have a problem, you can spend hours finding the perfect solution, or you can spend minutes finding a solution that works, Jake said. My people learned a long time ago that a working solution today is better than a perfect solution tomorrow. Professor Zethkar was quiet for a long moment. Your species developed this philosophy because of your planet's hostile environment? Partly, Jake replied. But mostly because we never had enough resources to build perfect solutions. We had to learn to make do with whatever we could find. That taught us to see potential in things that others might consider useless. The professor nodded slowly. And this ability to see potential in discarded materials, to improvise solutions under pressure, to prioritize function over form. These are survival skills that your species developed before you ever left your planet. Right, Jake said. We have been practicing survival engineering for thousands of years. We just called it fixing things with whatever was handy. Professor Zethkar made a decision that would change the Galactic University's curriculum forever. I am going to recommend that your methods be studied and incorporated into our survival training program. Not to replace our existing methods, but to provide an alternative approach. Jake grinned. You mean you want to teach aliens how to be more human? I want to teach them that there is more than one way to solve a problem, the professor replied. Your species may be new to space travel, but you have something to teach us about adaptability. As Jake gathered his remaining equipment and prepared to leave, Professor Zethkar made notes in his personal files about the need to completely review the survival curriculum. Today, a human student had demonstrated that sometimes the most primitive approach was also the most effective. The lesson had been intended to test the students. Instead, it had taught the teacher that wisdom could come from the most unexpected sources.